Welcome to today's event, the August member briefing. I'm Mital Lyons-Warren, the manager of R2 and local engagement with Americans for the Arts, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm a millennial white woman with curly brown hair up in a bun with the right side shaved down. I have on clear glasses and blue earrings, and I'm wearing a white shirt today, and I'm sitting in front of a gray and white wall with plants and art. I am seated on the ancestral and current lands of the Hatonkan or Anacostans in Washington, D.C., which neighbors the lands of the Piscataway and Pamunkey peoples. We have a great program planned today, and I'm excited to get started. But first, some quick reminders. Please note that this presentation is being recorded, and the recording will be available in a few business days on the activity page. An automated live transcript is available for viewing. To turn it off or on, press the CC or closed caption button at the bottom of your screen, and then select Show or Hide Subtitle. Resources for today's activity, like the New Haven Cultural Equity Plan, will be posted under the Resources tab of today's event page. There will be time for questions at the end of today's presentation, and you can submit those through the chat function. If you're interested in asking your question out loud, please raise your virtual hand and we'll invite you to unmute. Should you need any technical assistance today, please put them in the chat box and I, Mital Afta, will be sure to follow up. And with that, I'm pleased to pass to my colleague, Mandy Lee, Senior Membership Manager for speaker introductions.
Hello, thank you so much, Mital, for that introduction. Hi, again, my name is Mandy Lee, and I am the Senior Membership Manager at Americans for the Arts. I'm a white woman in my 30s with a dark brown ponytail wearing a blue and white polka dot blouse, sitting on a gray couch in front of a gray wall. And I'm calling today from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands of the Dogue and Piscataway people past and present who have stewarded the land now known as Alexandria, Virginia for generations. This is a member briefing for Americans for the Arts, a national service organization working to ensure that every American has access to the transformative power of the arts. To that end, a recording of this meeting will be shared publicly on YouTube to allow more people to engage with this important conversation about art, culture, and equity in our communities. For those of you joining us live, we will be doing a Q&A and towards the end of our discussion, so please feel free to put your questions and comments in the chat. I'd love to introduce our guest for today's discussion, Adrian Jefferson, Director of Cultural Affairs for the City of New Haven, Connecticut, and Daniel Fitzmaurice, Chief of Staff for Americans for the Arts. Daniel previously served as the Executive Director for the Arts Council of Greater New Haven, and I'm very excited to have you both here today to talk about a very exciting project that you collaborated on for the City of New Haven. Daniel and Adrian, welcome. Would you like to say anything about yourselves before we get started?
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I just want to say I am a Black Indigenous woman of color. I am both Nipmuc, Cherokee, and Narragansett, and I am currently on the lands of the Quinnipiac and the Wampachee people, and just really glad to be in conversation with my good friend, Daniel.
Yeah, same. And I'm Daniel, and I used to be there where you are, Adrian, but I'm actually in the offices at Americans for the Arts, which is on the native lands of the Piscataway people in Washington, D.C. I am a millennial white cisgender man with brown hair, floral shirt, and bright blue glasses as usual.
Thank you so much. It is wonderful to have you here. And just to get started, can you tell me and all of us a little bit about how you started working together?
Well, Daniel and I was like, Daniel, do you want to take that question?
No.
Daniel and I have been working together for quite some time now. Our relationship first started when I was working at the State of Connecticut Office of the Arts. Shout out to the Office of the Arts. I was a program manager there at the time. And so Daniel actually began his role as the executive director of the Arts Council in New Haven at around the same time that I started my position as the program manager, as one of the program managers in the state. And we worked closely together just by way of our work, but also I think by way of our values, right? A lot of the work that we both were focused on was around activating younger communities, Black Indigenous people of color in those communities, and just found like a shared alignment with the type of work that we were doing. Daniel, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I think, well, it's funny to try to that's how we started working together technically, right? But then I think what I've come to learn and appreciate is that obviously we have many differences in our background, many differences, but also we have a lot in common as far as our life experiences coming up as young people in the arts, emerging into leadership at various ways, and having just, unfortunately, that shared experience, right, of like having to work in challenging organizations and complex environments really early on. And I just think we immediately, even though we didn't know we were connecting around that, that's what we were connecting around. And then trying to build systems in our own, when we were able to, in our own space and our own organizations, to change those systems so that we could have passed those on in a different way for the folks coming up behind us. I don't know if that's like if that's like over glorifying it, but I just feel like that's a common thread. It took me a few years to understand between us, but that's a big part of it.
And I think too, more formally, the relationship really consisted of, like, a lot of times we would do things in the office around a fiscal sponsor of some of our programs, just by nature of the way the state works versus the way a nonprofit works with getting dollars into the community. And the partner that we kind of went with based on our values and their values was the Arts Council. So it really allowed for this liaison relationship between the work I was doing at the state and then the work that was happening in the city, not knowing that I would eventually be in the city, right? I think it was part of the master plan of Daniel, of course. But I think that really did allow way for a pathway of building a working relationship that really didn't exist there before.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So one of the main things I want to talk about today is the cultural equity plan that the two of you helped to work on for the city of New Haven. But just for all of us here, can you just first tell us what is a cultural equity plan?
Well, I could say a little here, because I think it's important to know what it's not, I guess, as far as where this kind of started. So the Arts Council in Greater New Haven, where I was, and shout out to my friends who were there on this call, has historically been involved in planning. Like a lot of local arts agencies, whether you're nonprofit or governmental or whatever, there's some planning, that kind of community-wide planning that happens. And I had known when I came in that maybe, there's some planning we should do now, right? We hadn't done planning since like the 90s. And when we had done it, it was very revolutionary. But what I learned is that it was a very like top-down type of planning. It was like all the super grass tops leaders in the community created this cultural plan. But a big piece of it, a big lesson I took away from that was it wasn't implementable. And what I mean by that is, like, it was so top heavy that it wasn't even really possible to move some of those ideas forward. There was actually no momentum in the communities on the ground to make those things happen. Another thing I used a lot in the beginnings of this was actually, and this is long before I had this affiliation with Americans for the Arts, but there's a great research study called Cultural Planning at 40, kind of acknowledging that the field of cultural planning had reached kind of a 40-year milestone. And a really big thing in that document, I don't have the exact quote, but it was something essentially how there's a lot of conversation in this industry about equity, but not a lot of planning processes that are centering equity. And that was a really big aha moment for us at the Arts Council, to kind of acknowledge that we really needed to have a cultural equity plan, not just an equity plan. But I'll pass it to Adrian to acknowledge that it's not like then the Arts Council went and decided we were going to do it, right? Because there's actually a real kind of advocacy angle in how we decided to approach it.
Yeah, and I think, and I'll segue off of what you said, because I think you were going in like the perfect direction, right? Like, what is a cultural equity plan not? And what is a cultural plan? What are those two differences, and how do they measure up against each other, right? So when you look at a cultural plan is traditionally what most cities and towns do. You look at the cultural vitality in your city, in your town, in your area. You measure like the data of the economics, the vitality, the vibrancy, and just what it's doing for that particular city. You might touch upon diversity, equity, and inclusion as a check mark, right? Or as a point in the plan, but it is not centered on cultural equity. It's not centered on diverse, marginalized groups. And so what we wanted to do was a plan that's centered. It does the opposite. It's centering first the needs of the marginalized people, particularly in our case, Black and Brown and Indigenous people of color, right? That's what we needed to focus on based on the demographics of our city, which is 73% Black and brown. And so why wouldn't we have a plan that centers our population? And then from there, look into the data of like the economics and the vitality. All of that is still a part of the plan. It's just who it centers that is the difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's really where, though we had this realization, so like, aha, we realized we're not going to just do traditional planning, we're going to do like a values-based, equity-based planning process. We also waited for a while before, you know, really, we didn't just then decide, great, let's just start authoring it. So it was really specifically work the Arts Council was doing around advocacy during elections. And also shout out to our friends at Mass Creative who helped bring kind of the concept of Create the Vote into Connecticut. And so we were working with a team of local residents in New Haven to connect them with the candidates running for mayor at the time, when this kind of, again, it wasn't like they were using the language we were using. They weren't saying, what we want you to do is have a cultural equity plan. They were saying, resources aren't reaching me as an artist of color. Resources are not really getting to me in this neighborhood where I live and have a kind of cultural organization or a library or a startup kind of a creative endeavor. So it was really like the symptom was what kind of kept coming up. And so when that kind of came up as an issue, essentially, in the mayoral election related to the arts, like equity was an issue to begin with. And then when artists started talking about it from an arts perspective, it kind of got in both of the mayors, everyone who's running kind of adopted a certain kind of platform about that. And so then a kind of natural thing happened, which is that the mayor-elect organized these listening sessions, and arts and culture were one of the topics of those listening sessions. Like there was a table at all the listening sessions about arts, culture, and libraries, right, Adrian?
Yep.
And so then I didn't sit there, me myself as like a grass top and a white person, and was like, hey, let's have a cultural equity plan. But we'd already done a lot of organizing around this idea around arts and equity. And honestly, just the needs of the artists and arts organizations in the area. So it just came up in those tables, and it was part of the mayor's recommendations as he was coming into office and as he was thinking about people to select to run the cultural affairs office. So it's, I just want to emphasize that kind of, it's a very like bottom up way that this kind of came through, which really only continued as this went through. And again, there are various outcomes that could have created from that. Like it might not have been, well, we're going to make a cultural equity plan, but there's definitely a real emphasis on culture and equity being connected, thanks to this kind of engagement of folks in the community.
And I want to say real quick, before we move on, it's just that Daniel touched on something that's really important, and it's just terminology. Like sometimes we get so caught up in terminology, like, oh, this is cultural equity, this is arts for anti-racism. And yes, we have a manifesto, should you say, of a cultural equity plan. So it makes sense to like reference that. But like a lot of the times the people that we're serving or we're seeking to serve in the community do not know what we are talking about, right? What they know is that the services and the resources that they need are not reaching them. That's what they know, right? And so then it was up to us as the arts leaders, as the cultural equity leaders, the thought leaders on this, to be able to take that and say, okay, what we need to put in practice, right, as arts practitioners is a cultural equity plan. But I always think that, and I'm sure we'll get into this a little later, cultural equity is about action. It is so much more than just the plan. If you are not implementing the action, and actually in our case, the action came first. We were doing programs before we actually came up with a plan, because there's a sense of responsiveness that cannot wait to our community.
So can you talk a little bit more about what were some of those programs that you launched, in those early stages before the plan was even developed?
Yeah, oh my gosh, a lot. So we have to remember, so we developed this plan. Actually, I'm saying we have to remember, like it's just me and Daniel, but for those who don't know, I started my position as the director of cultural affairs a month before the pandemic. So the entirety of my job outside of right now has been in this pandemic. And during the pandemic, we also saw social unrest, right? So not only are we dealing in the arts with a global pandemic, dealing with things we've never dealt with before in the arts, we also now have the murder of George Floyd. We also have the murder of Breonna Taylor. We have the murder of Ahmaud Arbery, amongst many other Black and brown bodies who we saw killed on national television, right? And so there's this call for us to have to be very different in the arts right now. And what that required for Daniel and I is to really work together in what we would do to partner to make sure that our city had the resources that it need, particularly the Black and Brown community who was exacerbated and struggling. Their inequities were exacerbated and struggling during this time. And so we came up with a variety of different programs. The first program that we launched was the Creative Sector Relief Fund. I believe that we might have been one of the first cities in the nation to launch this. We wanted to be able to have unrestricted dollars that would go into low-income communities without all of the paperwork, the heavy paperwork required to get the money to artists. And so we were able to fund over 500 artists, or just about 500 artists, to get, small amounts of money to their door so that they can pay for their groceries, they can pay their rent, or they can pay just to continue to do their art. So we launched that program. We launched the Unapologetically Radical Conference, which is a conference that talks about social justice issues as it pertains to the Black and Brown community, but using hip hop as a mechanism for change. This is something that has globally touched over 1,000 people for every time we do this virtual conference. This is something we wouldn't have done if the pandemic hadn't happened, right? Maybe if the George Floyd murder had not happened. We launched the Arts for Anti-Racism Pledge, making sure that our arts organizations are accountable for all of the solidarity statements that they were releasing. How are you going to change? How are you going to better help and make sure your policies are really open to all types of people? What does that look like for you? So those are just some of the things that we were doing in the Black Lives Matter painting community paint days that we did, which really was more than just painting Black Lives Matter on the street. It really was about like how you embody your community and work with them to cultivate statements, to cultivate messaging, to better empower your community. Daniel, maybe I'm missing some things.
No, you're what the only thing you'd be missing is that the pandemic was so happening, right? I mean, so everything got put on pause, right? So really, the gift of the pandemic, if there is one, the kind of the silver lining as far as some of this work was going, was this sort of chance to completely refresh what was going on. So nothing that had historically been done between either of our organizations needed to continue necessarily. And so what was really exciting is we both had this, we kind of invited a team of consultants and a co-creation team of artists and activists from the city who were all compensated for their work creating the plan. But then we were also, through our organizations, kind of driving iterations of programs and activities that, of course, were kind of decided outputs from the plan, right? So there's kind of this relationship between planning and doing, planning and doing, planning and doing. And I would say the biggest part of that was so much trust that was built between those folks involved in those activities and the planning. And I mean, there's a lot of mistrust between nonprofits and government, local arts agencies, right? So there was a lot of kind of testing of that trust through these processes. Like, are you really going to get the money out to me in 2 days? Are you really going to trust me to participate in this planning process? Or you really want to know what I think in this survey or in this listening session? So there was a lot of sort of trust building that I think was engaged throughout that, because we didn't just wait until this plan was done and then we started doing programming. We really leaned into the needs all throughout this process. It was very fluid. And I would say that, and we could talk more if you want, Mandy, about exactly like how you do it, but I would just say there's so many ways that kind of the having this document, like having this pink document, has been really valuable. But one thing I've noticed now is that like arts organizations and artists have adopted the cultural equity plan in their own practice, in their own planning. And so while we in our agencies, which are kind of co-creating this with folks, we're doing that live, now that it's published, we see local funders and local organizations and local artists also then using it. Like the document is really valuable, but it is only paper. That's a quote somewhere in this. I think it was, yeah, our friend Steve Driffin, we will never be able to capture the whole beauty of this process on paper. It lives in us. But like, I also want to underscore, you do need the paper because people have read this.
You do need the
referenced
paper.
it and adopted it, and boards of directors are reading it and adopting it. And, it is valuable kind of testament to the work, and it allows this to continue while you at Adrian at the city continue, right, doing this as well.
That's right. Well, and I think too, you hit on something really important, and I think I'll continue on that way. It's not just arts organizations. It's it's cross-sector, right? This is something that is being utilized by health departments. This is something that's now being utilized by reentry centers. This is something that's being utilized by economic development. Like, this is crossing over sectors, and it's centering equity. It's centering culture in a way that shows the significance of the arts. And it's really important. And it also goes back to your question of what is cultural equity? Well, that's what cultural equity is. It actually doesn't just center the arts. It says that the arts is a vital tool that is used to create a healthy ecosystem. Well, what is a healthy ecosystem? A healthy ecosystem is people who have access to transportation and healthcare and mobility, and a way to use their everyday lives to be sustainable, to be happy, and to not just live, but to thrive in their lives. That's what cultural equity is. It's not just the arts. When we look at only the arts, we box ourselves in. When we say that the arts is a tool and a mechanism to do all of these things, that's when we really have an understanding of the power of cultural equity, really.
So if I am someone who's on this call or is watching this video and saying, like, this is all really exciting to me, and this is something that this is a process I want to engage in my organization or my town or my city or whatever, what are some sort of hard skills or like first steps into getting this to happen for them? And what is the first steps they need to take to make this happen?
Well, I would say, Daniel hit on this earlier. The way that our process started was through a community engagement process, right? It wasn't one that we activated, but because, the intentionality came because the mayor-elect needed to run a series of charrettes and town halls and focus groups. But, I would say people have a one-up now, knowing that, yes, the way you start is by getting buy-in from your community, seeing if there's a need, if there's a want for a cultural equity plan, seeing what their needs are so that you can design a plan around their needs in a very intentional way. So I would start with focus groups, charrettes, town halls, gathering all of that information and all of that data. Now, another thing I would say is starting to have conversations with people in higher power around adopting this plan. If you work in a municipality like I do, and you work for a mayor, starting to have that conversation and educating your mayor or educating your chief of staff on what cultural equity actually is. Those conversations to start happening now. We have to advocate for ourselves around these areas, because people usually don't even know what we're talking about when we're talking about just arts in general. People are always lost. So you best believe they're going to be lost when you talk about cultural equity. So we have to start advocating around that now. And I will also say, because people's communities look very, very different, right? I know that, like, our community is 73% Black and brown. And so some folks may be like, well, my community doesn't look like that. I would say that, there's nothing wrong with being prepared for what your community will look like in the future, because by 2044, we know that the demographics are going to look very, very different. And it is highly possible that if your community is not super diverse now, it will be in a few years. So maybe see this as a preparation plan for how we are ready right now, right? And not waiting until there is a demand. Do it now, because that's what we should be doing as arts and cultural practitioners.
Yeah, I'll underscore. I just wanted to say listening. That's what the simple way is, like, really, really listening, and listening to really learn and understand, because without getting too detailed into the definition of equity, I mean, a big part of what you'll read in this is about inequities. Like, any inequities you have in your community can be addressed through the arts, right? So there's ways, if it's race, great. If it's gender, fine. If it's, there's a variety of ways you can kind of think about inequities, and how a cultural equity plan could be part of kind of connecting that in your particular geography, whatever it is. And to also oversimplify it a little bit, you'll see there's a co-creation team, which I kind of mentioned, but there is an importance that we placed, I think, Adrian, on kind of identifying less than traditional leaders, quote unquote, through the arts and culture creative lens. And we really gave them the tools and the resources and the trust to run this process and run this planning. So, there's 130,000 plus residents of the city of New Haven. Did we talk to every one of them? No. Did we?
Right.
So don't be intimidated by the impossibility sometimes, but see what is possible. And this group of leaders, about a dozen people, the trust they built with each other, the things they learned together, the things they brought forward together, the struggles they wrestled with together. I mean, it was a beautiful group and process, and it is replicable, right? We could repeat this in New Haven every 3 or 4 years and continually build that. So it's not really just like a terminating experience. It's a real process that will unfold over time. So there's always a way to start, even if it's no matter how small it feels like that, there's a way to get started.
You really lifted the word trust several times, and I want to come back to that. And I want to talk a little bit about how did you start to build trust? Because I'm assuming that there are some levels of inherent distrust as you're starting this process, whether that's within your offices or that's within your community. And you talked about that process, a time frame of trust building, but what were some tangible things that you all were doing to help build trust?
Mandy, it's the zillion
Well,
dollar question.
I think there's a couple of things. It really is a great question, actually, because it all starts with trust. It really does. And the center of it is trust and honesty, and allowing for that to have space, right? Without it being influenced by us as people who are essentially gatekeepers, right? So I believe that like trust started before the plan. And I think that's why it's so important to understand that like cultural equity is very much in action. There was a lot of distrust for the city. There still is, right? But with my particular department, I can now say that we have trust because we've been doing the work by going into the community without an agenda, starting to be in community with the folks we want to build with the folks who we are neighbors with, right? And really starting to allow them to just know us as humans, right? There's that essential fact. But then as far as trust in this process, it wasn't easy, right? We had to first really sit down. Daniel and I probably sat down months and months in advance before we talked to anyone and said that if we're going to do a cultural equity plan that's holding up this high moral and value standard in the arts, we have to be able to practice that ourselves. So how can we build trust into the process? Well, we first need to start with hiring community consultants who are anti-racist, anti-bias in their thinking and in their practices, and who have a track record of doing that historically in this city, right? So we started there. Then we brainstormed with them, with this group of consultants, the Civic Impact Lab, and we said, we really need a community advisory board that's going to lead this process. We don't want to lead this process. Matter of fact, we can't lead this process. It actually has to come from the community in order to get buy-in and in order to serve them the way that they need. It has to be their voice over our voices. And so that's when we decided what this co-creation team process was going to look like, and went through another rigorous process of deciding what that was going to look like, who was going to be on there, what type of voices were needed, what kind of seats at the table could we create. So long story short, we go through this process, and then there's the actual process of them being in community together, right? And I think the trust was established because Daniel and I were not involved in that part of the process. When it came time for them to sit down and have a conversation on all the issues of culture in the city of New Haven and all the possibilities and all of the solutions, they did that amongst themselves in a trusted space that we provided, and we allowed them to advise us. And that's why it was established, because our intentions were no longer being questioned, because we weren't in there trying to direct what they needed to say. And so that was very much a part of the process. Like Daniel said, listening, like thinking about the fact that, at first we thought we would get this done in a year? This cultural equity plan, I don't know why we were so ambitious, but we said it was going to be done in a year.
Yeah.
It was not a year, right? It was honestly, it was a little over 2 years if we include the pre-planning time that Daniel and I were doing. And what happened was the co-creation team and the consultants were like, listen, if you want to do this right, we need fluidity. We need more time to build, to heal, to reconcile, to be honest about the issues, and to come back to you with what we feel the solutions are. Like, there needs to be space for that. So for us, as people who are like, we promised the plan, right? I promised the plan to the mayor, right? It's like, who am I serving though? Like, yeah, I'm at the pleasure of the mayor, but I serve the people, right? So like, we have to adopt processes that reflect that. And I think that's my opinion on how the trust was built. I don't know, Daniel.
1,000%. And I would just want to I'm going to ground it in like a real story, right? So because what you're saying, I think part of what you're saying is time. It takes a lot of time, and it's really slow. And that was something we allowed and centered. And like, we didn't want to, you can't make a cultural equity plan out of oppressive structures, right? So you have to kind of lean into that at every juncture. And I would say, like, we did that, for example, Adrian, at the press conference, right? Like, the press conference was all about the co-creation team. it centered artists. We allowed artists to read poems that were explicitly telling something to the mayor about what happened in the news that week. But a particular moment that no one would have been part of except you and I, Adrian, that I feel like I can share is we had a meeting with the mayor at kind of a really important point in the planning process. And the consultants and the co-creation team started the meeting like they started all their meetings with 5 minutes of breathing.
Yes.
They didn't get the mayor did it. He didn't get a pass for not being part of the process and like not allowing the time and space. And they explained it after they did it. They're like, just so you know, like we knew we could have skipped this with you, but like we want you to know what we're doing as a group to make sure that this process is really authentic and is really values driven and is really healing and liberating for people. And it just stood out to me as a really clear practice that at every step along the way, that was a reminder that like the product is the process more than anything else.
Well, the chat is already starting to blow up, so I'm going to actually devote a little bit more time to this Q&A process because I think there's a lot of great questions that are coming up. The first being, are printed documents and white papers available describing your assessment and inventory process and implementation?
Our white papers? I'm not really sure I'm understanding exactly what that question is.
I think what they're asking is, do you have, and I don't know if this person has had a chance to read the cultural equity plan or not yet, but do you have anything written down or any sort of standard operating procedures or best practices you come up with for the assessment process as you're going through?
So one thing I will say is that that's a really great question. Yeah, like how we're going to continue to assess the progress of the plan and the impact of the plan is the way I'm hearing that question. So there's a few different things. When we announced the launch of this plan, and actually in the plan itself, so I think it's really important to read it. We say this is an evolving document. This is actually not finished. Why is it not finished? It's because arts and culture is continually changing. Our communities are continually changing, and we're going to continue to involve the co-creation team and our residents to continue to evolve that plan. Now, with that said, one thing that we have been doing is in communication with our Cultural Affairs Commission on an assessment product on it every year. And we're hoping by the end of 2023, we would be able to do the first assessment of the progress of this plan and using the data, because outside of this, we've started to actually do a lot of the action items in the plan, right? A lot of the things of neighborhood pop-ups, neighborhood festivals, reinvestment of dollars into Black and Brown communities. This is work that we were already doing and that we're continuing to do in new programs. So we have surveys and assessments in place for that. And so we're utilizing that to now come up with a thorough assessment of where we are at the 1 year mark, which will happen in January of 2023. And that's not available yet because it does not exist yet. We are in the process of doing this.
So that is a stay tuned answer. Another thing that someone threw in here a little later is white papers are usually one-page summaries you give to lawmakers, people in power to support what you're doing. So success story on one page, if that was some terminology that anyone was looking for clarification, I appreciate that. There's another question here about in-person sessions. So I'm curious, obviously this was done in the deep heart of the pandemic. Were most of these listening sessions and town halls online? Did you have any like outdoor in-person sessions? How did you help bridge that digital gap of the space in a digital space can feel a little less personal perhaps than an in-person event?
Yeah, so one thing, I mean, the co-creation team met almost totally virtually with a few exceptions, just social exceptions. So, but I will say that was also made it possible for some of them to participate. Of course, they were compensated on that team, but you know, various life circumstances, ways that they could connect virtually and actually collaborate virtually as far as actually making this. But I would say, I mean, we tried a lot of different formats and they helped try a lot of different formats. There was a survey, there was a virtual sessions. There were also like very focused focus groups. And what I mean by that is like, we really leaned on the co-creation team, for example, someone who had real kind of connection to youth in the community to be like, can you just pull together some youth and like have a conversation about this? So we like, it wasn't a published public thing. It was a really close, like I'm on the co-creation team and I just want to talk to you about this plan we're making. And it was using the essentially like trusted relationships they had in the community to move that forward. And then also, Adrian, I'll pass it off to you a little bit more because you're doing, again, the engagement doesn't stop when it's published. So you've then taken it up and continued doing the work of making sure that this pink document doesn't just sort of sit on anyone's desk, but that it actually is activated in communities and bodegas and neighborhood libraries and whatnot.
Yeah, so we did, so I want to add, and then I will tell you what we've been doing to continue the work of the plan. But community canvassing is actually something that I think Daniel is referring to when it came to putting these affinity groups together. We realized even with the survey, like there's only typically a certain population of people who are going to take surveys or feel comfortable coming to town halls or feel comfortable stepping foot in city hall, for example, right? So really being intentional about going to people's door knocking, and trusting on those who we have hired and we've decided to work with to build those relationships with the community who already have existing relationships is how we got a lot of feedback. I would say a lot of the feedback that we got that was very relevant to the plan actually didn't come out of the town halls. I would say that it came out of the canvassing. It came out of the affinity group spaces. It came from the door knocking and the canvassing of the neighborhoods. That's where a lot of the information came, because that's where the population was. Again, a lot of people weren't showing up to these town halls because they didn't know it was for them, right? So I would encourage anyone, when you do this plan, to really look at your branding, how you do it, because branding and marketing will speak to specific audiences. So how are we going to do it in a way that's more intentional, right? So it's kind of a takeaway for us. If I say something that we could do different, I would do that different. But as far as what we're doing now, we said we would continue the work. Matter of fact, on the back of the plan, if Daniel was to hold it up, I think it says continue the work, right? And then it has like how you can do the QR code and shows how we would do that. It was really important for us to do a cultural equity tour, and we wanted to be able to take this plan around and workshop it within the community, with residents, with other arts administrators, with other arts and cultural leaders in nonprofit organizations, and talk about the implementation of the plan. And so with that, we partnered with our co-creation team, and we hired some of them again to facilitate these conversations. We did everything from workshop styles to panel to actually me speaking as like a keynote. We did all different types of methods that work with different audiences and meet the needs and the demands of different groups. So that's how we continued the work, to further hear what people thought about the plan, what people felt were missing from the plan, what people really resonated with and wanted to see us kind of like up the ante on some of these things. And actually, it's been really instrumental in helping us now launch new programs and initiatives based off of that particular feedback.
I'm seeing some questions here about budget and how much this cost. I don't know if you all can talk about specific numbers, but there's curiosity about the cost for the project and what agencies were contributing to the funding for this project.
Yeah. That is a very great question. I'll take a stab at it first, and then Daniel, you can let me know. He's always good when I miss something. He'll just jump.
I feel like I'm usually the one crunching the numbers, but I'm not there anymore, so I don't have access to what I used to have access to. But
I think in general, for the actual plan itself, like the plan, the co-creation team, the consultants, Daniel and myself fundraised $65,000. This plan was $65,000, and honestly, when I tell other people that, they're like, "That's nothing. That's not a lot of money." Exactly. We did a lot with very minimal resources, right? We went to funders and said, this is what we want to do. The city, my department, we did contribute some dollars towards that 65,000 as well. That allowed us to tap into other things that we were not able to make through the funding. But typically that's what we use. Our co-creation team, I don't remember what we paid them stipends. I think of about $1,500.
I think that's right.
And that's not a lot of money for the amount of time that they put in. So I do want to say, like, we are still dealing with minimal capacity, minimal resources that we had to try our best to make work. The way that we have continued to compensate them for their time is by, like I said, doing workshops, asking them to be facilitators, continuing to have them involved in the street team efforts, and paying them for their time. Anytime we ask them to do something, it comes with compensation, right? But I also think we have to acknowledge that we have a capacity issue, like a funding capacity issue, right? Like, don't have me get into like the arts and, you know, arts advocacy and needing more dollars to make these things happen. But yeah, it's about $65,000 in short.
Yeah, and just to clarify too, like the Arts Council of Greater New Haven is a regional nonprofit local arts agency, and the city is the City of New Haven's Cultural Affairs Office. So, you know, this partnership is connected. Like, and we knew, I think, Adrian, right? We were very clear. Like, our role in this is we'll get the money to you. we'll set the essential container for this to happen, but then we're out, then that's it. And again, it's sort of, I mean, this is a little bit of a soapbox for me, but
Very
again,
involved.
yeah,
No,
but
yeah,
thinking
we're
about
very.
us, no, we were involved, but like thinking of us as, though we are, the support we could offer here was money and some of our time and expertise and shared values, right? But, knowing that, that was a need, right? We really needed this plan. It was coming up, but to invest in it and invest mostly in people. I mean, it's not like it went into like graphics and like fancy things like that.
That's
It went
right.
into the people that were here. And we were so often, we asked people to give us their ideas and advice for free. And so to finally, even if the compensation might feel inadequate, or if 1,500 feels like an insane price from where you are, any amount of compensation that is dollars, not coffee and lunch, I think does go a long way in acknowledging that these folks are consulting with you. They're experts at the thing they're telling you about, which is themselves and their communities.
I have another question here about funding. Did you receive any in-kind support from businesses, foundations, anything like that?
Did we? Honestly, I consider what the Arts Council did to be a lot of in-kind support. Daniel worked on this very diligently, that he gave his staff time to be a part of this. There were other resources we utilized from the Arts Council that were not included in our original budget. So the in-kind expenses were covered by the Arts Council. And actually that really speaks to the type of partnership that I also see was brought in the chat on like how unique it is for a city, a municipal arts agency to partner with an arts council that's in the same region. Like we partnered in a way that really makes sense for us to continue to be able to support our arts community, right? And also to support each other, because in ways where I did not have capacity, I've been able to rely upon the Arts Council, who may have had more capacity in certain areas. And it worked in order for us to get this initiative done.
Mm-hmm. And vice versa. And we didn't really, I mean, that number 65, that's like the raw cost, not the
I'm sure it's much more than that.
Overhead, salaries, anything like that. That's just like what was spent out the door.
For the actual plan itself. Yeah.
So I want to dig into this comment a little bit more about the idea of it being unique to have a city and an arts organization partnering on a project like this, rather than sort of jockeying for control over it, being able to have ownership at the end of the day. So besides the fact that you two work really well together, and so we obviously had a connection between these two agencies, what kind of advice would you give to someone who is looking to bridge that that connection between a municipality and a local arts organization?
Go slow.
I'm like, Daniel, you're perfect to kick this one off.
Well, listen, I know intimately because I was at the Arts Council before Adrian arrived. And so there was not alignment, right? There was actually quite a lot of competitiveness, and that's common in the arts, right? We are, rather than thinking of ourselves as connected and part of one ecosystem, too often thinking of ourselves as competitors between each other and like kind of jockeying for resources and attention. I think between the city and, I mean, we talked about this, Adrian, like, the city and the Arts Council, like there just wasn't an embedded way for us to have a relationship. I mean, there's a lot of, I could just go back to organizing, I guess, like bringing people together is work. And especially at the local level, like continuously inviting people together, including people that you disagree with from city government or business communities or what have you, like seeing the arts as a bringing together kind of group, like a convening agent, is really key, because ultimately that does drive that kind of essential value around people and what we're trying to do for people. So when you reach those alignments, and we've talked about this, Adrian, like how do we like codify this moving forward so it's not just personality driven, but truly is embedded in the way the city and the Arts Council thinks about their work. That's not done yet. That's just like an ongoing thread, because there are, and I know now a little bit, there are some structures around the country that have a lot more clarity around that role and the way the work happens together. I also want to lace in a slight answer to someone else's question related to this about the co-creation team. Whew. It's because it kind of gets to your point, Mandy, about like, who do you select to move a cultural equity plan forward, right? You might not select your municipality for any number of reasons. You might not select your local arts council for any number of reasons, but I don't think that should stop you from thinking about how you organize people together about this work. But one thing that I think we looked at a list, and the consultants and really helped us with this list. They asked a lot of people, like, we're doing this work, here's the basic idea, who should we think about? And I would say, Adrian, that one of the big things is kind of thinking about people who are kind of not ego driven in what they are. We really didn't invite a lot of arts organization leaders, if any,
Yeah.
into the co-creation team, because we really didn't want it to be institutionally driven. We wanted to be institutionally held later, but not driven by single-minded interests of organization leaders. Or maybe even within community context, like thinking about folks who are more kind of servant leaders in how they think and what they do, not focused on just them and their needs and their kind of specific viewpoint. So it was very important to kind of cultivate a list of like 100 names down to just the right 12 or 14 that
Yeah.
were gonna fit that criteria. And that's not to say the other people are bad people or that they're like not culturally equitable, but like it's a type of work that required a certain set of soft skills that we really wanted to make sure were in place.
And I think, yes, that's spot on. And also I want to uplift that if you do decide to, so if the city does decide to do a cultural equity plan and maybe it's not commissioned by the city, I do think the city should have some level of involvement. And the reason I believe that is because we now have created arts policy, because this is an official document of the city that we must abide by, right? So this is like legendary in that sense, where we have an official arts policy document for the first time in history in the city of New Haven that has been adopted, a cultural equity policy that has been adopted by the mayor, by the Board of Alders, the Cultural Affairs Commission, like all of the people who are the legislators, the political figures in power have said yes to this plan, in addition to the buy-in from the community, right? That now has set you up to really have a lot of power around the direction that the arts and culture will go in your city, especially as you start to do things where you may receive some pushback. You may receive some pushback when you're doing, because I have a lot of colleagues who are in my same role in other cities all throughout the nation who are like, how are you getting this done? My mayor told me no, right? The legislators here won't approve that, right? How are you doing this? Well, that's why we need to start advocating now, get the buy-in, because if you have that, you're really setting yourself up to really be able to serve your community really well through this plan.
I see some questions here about scaling this project and the idea of scaling it for a city the size of New Haven versus larger or smaller organizations. Can you give any pointers or thoughts about that?
Yeah, I have a new one in Asia. We haven't really talked about this yet. But like, for example, the National Endowment for the Arts has an equity plan right now. And we didn't have that to point at when we were organizing for this, but you know, that's a pretty significant scale. And that's a very different model. I mean, you could pull it up and you can see, you know, what it says. And you know, we also looked at other cities and what their plans looked like and like what their processes looked like. So I mean, there are, you know, I struggle a little bit around scaling it for the sake of scaling it, but I just want to acknowledge that like there's different ways that different people have addressed the concept, exactly to your point, Adrian, of taking cultural equity and making it policy, whatever that looks like. And that policy, and I guess I've been waiting to show this, but like the plan has blanks in it.
Yes.
Which, no credit. This is not me or Adrian's creativity. The
Not at all.
co-creation team really wanted this to also be interactive, because essentially the scale of one, like the scale of you and your own cultural equity awareness and plan, is actually a really big step. Like you might not have any buy-in from anybody else in your house or anybody else in your organization or anybody else in your town. But if you yourself have a commitment to cultural equity in what you do and how you act and how you move in the community, like that is huge. And that small is a reflection of what it is. So if it's helpful to point at the National Endowment for the Arts, like pull that in. If it's helpful to point at your own understanding about cultural equity and how you hold power and what you're using it for and who you're engaging it with, you know, that also is really significant type of scale to think about when it comes to this.
And everybody plays a role, right? Like that's pretty much what Daniel's saying. Everyone plays a role in cultural equity, right? And there's different components in that. You have the official plan, but then you actually have like the ethics of it, like the morals, the values that go into that, and being able to do that work. So this plan is very much also like a dismantling tool, right? That really allows us to look deep within ourselves at ways we might be complicit in, behaviors that do not uplift cultural equity and equitable practices, or in ways that we might be doing great work and we want to rev that up and we want to continue that further. It allows for deep assessment, and everyone, whether you're an individual or you want to approach this as an organization and all of your staff utilizing this plan, because of the activities in the plan that make this a living document, right? Which is a very unique thing for it to be a living document. I think being able to utilize that in itself is revolutionary, right? In itself is scaling up what I've seen from other cultural equity plans, to be honest. So I think it's really different in that sense.
Well, we were inherently acknowledging, I guess we knew this, but they really took it to the nth degree, that none of this can be solved by one agency or two agencies alone. It's really solved in a variety of ways. And I love this activity at the end. I was looking at this recently, Adrian. They ask you at the end to do an activity to resort all of the recommendations based on how hard they will be for you. And so it's like, again, it's not even trying to levy priority here. It's trying to say, like, equity is like the issue of our time. And it doesn't, just start, like, pick an area where you hold some control and power and just start, and then see where that takes you, and then keep going and see where that takes you. And that's, again, it's kind of an unplan, if you will, or kind of like unlearning what you might have expected from it. But it's also, I think, why the actual document has resonated with people, is because it is, it's an invitation to cultural equity. I think it says that somewhere. It's not like a doctrine that proves when this is done in a few years, we are done with it and equity is solved for. It's an invitation to perpetually be engaged in this work of cultural equity, because I don't think it's going to end. Well, that's my soapbox, I guess, but that's the point of that.
Well, also answering the question to scale, like a more formal answer would be that, and I don't know, Daniel, if you don't remember this, but in your role as the director of the director of Arts Council, you were going to take this plan and do it regionally. So the idea was always to scale it. It was like, all right, Adrian, let's get this city plan done, because then I'm going to take that and I'm going to use that as inspiration for what we do regionally, right? So there already was this kind of dedication and commitment to scaling around our region. And also we've been in partnership with the State of Connecticut Office of the Arts, right? Who also were one of our funders on the plan, which, we're in conversation with them all of the time, right? So there's ways to scale it based on partnerships and strategic alignment.
And I just want to reiterate for everyone that there's a link to this plan in the chat. If you can't find it, it will also be on the resources page of the website once this is uploaded. And you can also just find it by Googling New Haven, Connecticut Cultural Equity Plan. It is readily available online. And like I said, there are a lot of activities and things in it. It is an interactive plan. So if you want to, you can print it out and write things down or make notes on your PDF. But I think that's a really exciting element of this. We probably have time for just about 2 more questions. This one I see is, what cultural equity plans did you take inspiration from, or were there any cultural equity plans that inspired you in this process?
Yes, yes. We did a lot of research, of course. I know I did a lot of research. I was deeply inspired by New York City's cultural plan. They do not have a cultural equity plan, but if you look at their plan, it is centered in cultural equity, although they call it a cultural plan. They have a 5-point process over the amount of 5 years, the way that they would scale their work. And each year something would become accomplished towards one of their action items for a more equitable society. And I just was like so empowered. It was like seeing the work that they did that really made me be like, okay, I can see what we can do here in New Haven. I would also say that I think it was Baltimore, Washington, D.C., under their commissioner, their arts commissioner there, who is just dynamic, does dynamic work. Their plan is really strong too. And I don't know if they consider their plan a cultural equity plan or a cultural plan, but it looked very much similar to the direction we wanted to go.
I think it's important to lift too that nomenclature may be different depending on where you are. But the focus of the work centering equity in these cultural plans is really what you mean when you say cultural equity plan.
Yeah, I think also I was definitely inspired by what didn't work about lots of those plans. We definitely shared stories about like, well, all this money was spent on this thing and then nothing happened. And I also love the point they make, and this is from the co-creation team, right? That, I mean, I'm not a community organizer, but a lot of folks involved in this were, right? So really, it was really rooted in some of those practices around community organizing, like with communities, not planning for communities.
Or, yeah.
And so, you know, again, I think that sort of, there are inspirations here that are kind of indirect that I wouldn't necessarily carry into the room, but the team that was assembled here really carried into it, and they really wanted to, it says so in the opening, like, this is not, they didn't say this is not rocket science, but that's what they intended. I mean, like, this is work that happens all the time between people, especially people who have intentionally been excluded from things in our society, right? So this is, you know, lifting that up and acknowledging that, like, communities do this all the time, and inviting that expertise into the room is a really different way than just saying, like, look at these 5 plans from other cities we loved. I wish we could have one better than that. It's kind of like, wish we'd have one that was really like coming up from what exactly you all feel that's necessary.
That's right.
And how your experience suggests it. New Haven is sort of a legacied historic home of Black organizing. I mean, we don't need to, you can go into that history in another day and another time, but you know, so that it's sort of there in the community, and wherever there's organizing, wherever that is, in like faith groups or schools or, you know, libraries, like wherever that is in your community is a source of really good inspiration for this kind of work.
Well, in our last couple of minutes, are there any final thoughts or pieces of advice or surprising things that happened along the way that you want to close us out with? I feel like Daniel has one. I'm excited to hear it.
Surprising things? Well, I always want to ask Adrian. Can I ask Adrian a question, Mandy?
Please.
Oh, Daniel and his
Adrian.
question. Yes,
no, I'm
sir.
just, what is your favorite cultural equity action item right now?
Oh my
no, there's
gosh.
12 of them.
I like the one about further funding, and it's not specifically this language, but further funding into the neighborhoods. You know, there's one intentional effort around that, because I think finances is like historically an issue in Black and Brown communities, right? Like the wealth gap, like, and to me, that really addresses the fact that arts and culture can be used as a mechanism that helps to close the racial wealth gap, right? Because if we understand arts and culture and its benefits, you know, all of the money we make economically through arts and culture, then we can understand like what reinvestment of those dollars into Black and Brown community, the impact it can really have on the lives of people who are not yet receiving those dollars, right? So I like that one the most, because I think when we look at the inequities, when we look at what's hurting Black and Brown people the most, it actually is one of them is the wealth gap. So that's what's yours. What about you?
I've been drawing, just recently I've been drawing a lot of inspiration from 2, which is expand institutional definitions of culture and where culture happens. And I can't but not quote our friend and colleague Puma, and this is a later point in the document. She says, there's no culture to create in New Haven. There's a culture that is here, a history that is here. There's nothing to create. There's something to create space for.
Yes.
So again, like there's it's an action item of great intention and great value for, like, again, from me coming at an institution and with a lot of power to control, to expand that understanding and definition, not to try to replace or to try to inject culture or make a judgment there's no culture there, or there's not an absence of something, rather than to kind of allow that to be opened up and reveal it. So I just think that's just that's a point forever, right? That's just a point forever.
It's like place keeping, not
Yes.
place making, right? That's exactly what she's saying. I love that. I actually think that's the perfect one to land on. Daniel and I, we always talk about like our definitions of arts and culture look very different than other people's definition may look, because you know, it really can be just about anything when you look at the culture that's around you, and when you look at the fact that it expands beyond the arts. Arts is key and central, but it connects to so much more in the greater ecosystem. So
I think that's a beautiful note to end on. Thank you so much, Adrian and Daniel, for joining us today. And I'm going to pass it over to Mital to end us.
Yes, thank you, Daniel, Adrian, and Mandy, and thank you everyone that attended and participated in today's event, the August member briefing. As a reminder, this event was recorded and will be available for replay in a few business days on our R2 page. And as Mandy said, more widely available for the rest of the public for you to share. Be sure to visit us at artsu.americansforthearts.org for other training opportunity and resources. And we hope you have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.